So, as I'm sure all of you know, it's currently Halloween month, and we're all celebrating Halloween as if there's only 31 days in the entire month, and we're more than two-thirds of the way through it. And I decided to do something a little special this month, as I'm sure you all already know, one of my favorite horror movies of all time, possibly one of my favorite films of all time, certainly one of my favorite Halloween films of all time, is George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And one thing I've discussed on several occasions are all the influences of previous films which fed into Night of the Living Dead, which gave us the mega cult classic homage that is Night of the Living Dead. And tonight, I'm not going to give you all of them, but I'm going to present you with 10 of them that you may or may not have already considered. And there's certainly plenty more, and if you think I have any omissions, please put them in the comments below. And again, before I give you this top 10 list, please remember to like and subscribe and share and follow and do all those wonderful things I've been asking you to do. Follow me like a zombie that needs brains. But in any event, I'm going to present to you the list of the top 10 influences of Night of the Living Dead you may have not already heard of or thought of. And as always, I'm going to present them to you in no particular order. Number 10, The Epic of Gilgamesh. Yes, I know. Always dig deep for the first one. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh, as many of you know, is possibly the oldest example of literature from Western civilization, dating back between 2100 and 1200 BC. And I won't bother to get into the plot, by the way, even though it's an amazing plot and I think could be made as a modern day buddy film. But I'm going to stick to this one particular segment where the goddess Ishtar needs to go into the underworld to get her boyfriend Damuz back. And when her sister, Oreskadu, who runs the underworld, refuses, Ishtar becomes understandably upset by this and says all kinds of nasty things. I'll rip open the gates of hell, I'll tear the post off the hinges, I'll smash the lock, and the dead shall walk among the living, and the dead shall overwhelm the living. Now, so right here we see the idea that the dead is just going to suddenly spill back into the earth and wreak havoc. But more importantly, there's several different translations of this line, and in some, the word overwhelm is actually translated to consume or ingest. And there's a very real possibility she was suggesting that when the dead get back onto Earth, they're going to start feasting among the living. So you already have the hints of ghoulism in what is possibly the earliest example of playwriting we can find in our civilization. So, again, number 10, Epic of Gilgamesh. Moving on to number 9, and you probably should have seen this one coming if you follow my content page. It's Day of the Triffids, directed by Freddie Francis, starring Howard Keel and Janet Scott. Now, I know in this they're not the dead coming out of the ground, they're plant spores coming out of space. Kind of a reach, but when the plants reach adulthood, they pull out their roots and start wandering the earth looking for human victims, which they ingest. So is the idea of being eaten by the monster in question we see again, but more importantly, it's some of the tactics the people use to try to avoid being eaten. Particularly our lighthouse dwellers, Miss Scott being one of them. What they do is they break up all the furniture and block up all the doors and windows with hammer and nails. Like this is gonna help. And spoiler alert, in Day of the Triffids, it doesn't really help either. But just the idea people, their first instinct is to turn their home into a bunker. Another thing we see in Day of the Triffids is the bigger problem in a post apocalyptic movie where something is trying to eat you isn't the thing that's trying to eat you, it's the other humans trying to stay alive. Sometimes they're even more dangerous. And again, we see this in Day of the Triffids. Moving on to number 8, 1931's Dracula, based on the horror novel by Bram Stoker, directed by Todd Browning and starring someone who will feature quite frequently in this top 10 list, iconic Bela Lugosi. Now, I can hear the comments already. Zombies and vampires are two completely different kettles of fish. Granted, but they're both undead, and they both sustain themselves off living material. Vampires, blood, zombies, flesh, or brains. And depending on which substructure thread of the franchise you wish to follow, there's actually, for those Brian Aldiss fans out there, if you've read Dracula Unbound, which is he wrote it with the idea that he was going to become the next Michael Crichton and start like churning out novels into Hollywood. And sadly, it was never the case. But he wrote this one so it could become a Hollywood blockbuster, and it feels like it. But there's a wonderful segment where he discusses how vampires actually evolved from carrion eaters. Originally, they were carrion eating dinosaurs who found they could get better nutritional value off the living. They became parasitic. Anyway, he has a really, really good scientific explanation. It's something you can see right out of Matheson, who, guess what, is also mentioned later on this list. But again, without Dracula and the whole vampire lore, I think it would have been much, much more difficult to sell any type of zombie franchise. Moving on then to number 7, and here we see the crossover Last Man on Earth. Of course, based on I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Directed by, I'm going to butcher the name here, Sidney Salkow? And of course, starring late great Vincent Price. Now, here you see it's a very interesting distinction where they divide the zombies and vampires into two categories because zombies generally are just reanimated corpses. They don't have a lot of sentient functioning brain power. Vampires actually you can carry on a conversation with. They're simply the undead, but have a functioning cerebellum, I guess you'd say, in most cases. But in The Last Man on Earth, again, they're divided into two castes, and he does an excellent job explaining the difference between the two. And if you've seen Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, again, boarding himself up into a house, trying to stay alive. Again, the one man fighting force. Again, the deterioration of civilization. There would be no Night of the Living Dead without The Last Man on Earth. Moving forward to number 6, White Zombie, 1932, directed by Victor Helprin. And of course, again, starring Bela Lugosi. Now, while most traditional zombie lore is completely different than the undead lore of the Romero franchise, one certainly does lead into the other. Now, granted, we don't really know how the ghouls in Romero's films got started. There's some hints, but we don't truly know. In the earlier zombie lore, it's done with black magic. And witch doctors and people who've mastered the dark arts have brought the undead back to life for whatever reason. So it's a man-made problem, usually with man-made consequences. But the interesting thing about White Zombie is you really get a feel for later zombie lore. There's a wonderful scene towards the beginning where this sort of army of zombies are walking over a hill in mass, like something you'd see in a Romero picture. And there's this stagecoach driver, and he sees them and he wigs because even being around zombies could turn him into one, and he fears that greatly. You don't have the flesh eating yet, but you definitely see the sort of zombophobia we will see later on in future incarnations. Moving on to number 5. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, starring Stanley Kramer and Sidney Poitier and Spencer Tracy. Now, it's not a connection to zombie lore because they're going to dine on human flesh. No, no, not that at all. The connection is more cultural than contextual. Thanks to Mr. Portier, Hollywood could get behind a film where a black actor was the main character and could be given a role of strength and leadership, which sadly was something you didn't really see a lot of before. Thus, thanks to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, studios were more inclined to take a chance with a black leading man. Now, Romero swore, he swore on a stack of Bibles to the day he died, he did not cast Ben based on his race. Dwayne did the best interview, the best audition, and was best qualified for the part. You can't tell me Romero didn't at least consider race relations in the United States in the late 60s before he cast him. And let's face facts, it was really, really the smart play. It made the film culturally relevant as well as horror relevant. And moving on to possibly even more relevant film, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, based on The Purple Cloud by MP Shield. Um, Directed by Randall McDougal. We'll go with that, Randall McDougal. And starring, of course, Harry Belafonte. Now, here's something very interesting. Spoiler alert, long story short, there's a horrible pandemic of some sort causing everybody on Earth to die and basically evaporate. So, all we have left are three people: a very beautiful blonde woman, uh, one man who happens to be black, and one man who happens to be white. And hilarity ensues. Yes, you guessed it. The issue of how to rebuild the human population and maintain race relations sort of come crashing into each other. And you see a film which asks a lot of questions people weren't really wanting to ask in 1959. And the important thing here is, well, moving forward into The Living Dead, there is no sexual tension with Judith Uday with any character in the film, particularly Ben or even Mr. Cooper. However, that being said, Ben signs on almost instantaneously to be, um, sorry, I'm getting parched here, to be Judith O'Day's protector. And when Mr. Cooper shows up, he sort of tries to step in and takes over the reins, which causes the initial tensions between Cooper and Ben to be heightened. So while Barbara is not a sexual issue among any of the cast members, she becomes a very important elixir among the Dianetics of the cast. Moving on then to number three, A Time Machine. Of course, based on H.G. Wells' novella, directed by George Powell and starring Rod Taylor and Yvette Mimieux. Now, this is kind of a reach, but I had to read it in there. The whole power dynamics between the Eloi and the Morlocks, it's really human and zombie. I know the Morlocks, they have technology. The Morlocks are intelligent, arguably more intelligent than the Eloi, but there's just something very sinister, very dark, very scary about them. There's even a scene in the novel where the Eloi actually try to hold up in a place to defend themselves, protect themselves, to at least get some shelter from the Morlocks, and it's very not a living dead ish. So I honestly think Time Machine at least gave some flavoring to some influence to Romero's Not a Living Dead. What probably has even more influence, though, is H.G. Wells' Things to Come from 1936, directed by William Cameron Menzies, starring Raymond Macy and Sir Ralph Richardson. Something very important here. This was a very, very early attempt at a post-apocalyptic film. Long story short, when the Earth is embroiled in a second global conflict, it causes the collapse of the global economy. causing the nations of Europe to revert to, I guess you'd say, their medieval levels. In the course of this conflict, in the storyline, there's biological warfare, and it creates something known as the soldier sickness or a wandering sickness. And what the wandering sickness does is it causes people to, when they succumb to the high fever and the illness, they don't just lay there and rot. They actually get up and sort of walk around in this sort of catatonic state, spreading the infection. And while it's never shown that they're trying to eat the living, they just kind of walk around like zombies. The implication is that's how the contagion spread. The virus gets you to get up and start wandering around, and you can pick this disease up by casual contact. And of course, other people like "Ah, ah," and start running away. And again, apart from the eating of the living flesh, it's definitely a hallmark to later zombie lore. And the number one influence, and shame on you if this never occurred to you, the number one influence has got to be Plan 9 from Outer Space. And I'll tell you why. Now, well, right up the gate, in Not a Living Dead, the dead rise up and start eating the living. In Plan 9, what do the aliens do? They resurrect the dead. Plan 9. That's the one that involves the resurrection of the dead. Good luck. Yes, they come to Earth and they start reviving the dead who then go around and start killing people. Not necessarily eating them, but killing them. Now, here's where the real fun fact kicks in. In the original conceptualization of Dead a Living Dead, Romero foresaw it was an alien invasion movie. And one of the things the aliens do as the harbinger of their invasion, it's sort of like, was it that movie a few years ago? First Wave, Fifth Wave, uh, uh, Cause Wave. um, the attack is in stages, and one of the things that the aliens do when they come to Earth is to create like a shock army. They resurrect the dead, they reanimate the dead, who then go around and start biting people. In fact, if you listen really, really closely to an uncut version of Not a Living Dead, one of the radio announcements, not the one that's televised, but one of the radio announcements says that right before uh, things got real, there were reports of UFO sightings in the given area. And that's because that was supposed to come in later and be germane to the plot. Romero decided it was completely unnecessary, and he probably didn't want to get sued by, of all people, Ed Wood. So that was put aside. It just became a zombie movie, and part of the cool undercurrent of it is we never do find out what actually caused the zombies to reanimate. But again, one movie is about aliens resurrecting the dead, and the other movie is about aliens resurrecting the dead. The parallels write themselves. But anyway, that's the top 10 list I have for you folks tonight. Let me know what you think. If any of these don't hold water, please let me know. If there's a glaring omission that you feel I really should have covered, I can think of a couple myself actually. Please let me know. But anyway, please like, subscribe. Hopefully you enjoy this, and hopefully you all have a wonderful, wonderful Halloween. Be good, be safe, be careful, and that's all I have for you for now. So, peace.